The train didn't arrive with a sound. No whistle. No rumble of wheels. It was simply there, waiting as if it had always been. You didn't remember hearing it approach. One moment, the hill ahead of you was empty. The next, a single silver train sat on the tracks, gleaming under the faded blush of twilight. You stood still for a moment, watching. There were no other people around, no signs or schedules, no station platform, just the train and the quiet breath of the wind brushing the grass. You felt no fear, only the smallest tug in your chest, a feeling like you'd forgotten something important, and this might help you remember. The train door opened with a gentle hiss, and you stepped forward without needing to decide. Your feet moved before your mind caught up. Inside, the air was warm and scented faintly with cedar and something older dusty books, polished wood, candle wax. The lights glowed softly, not harsh like fluorescence, but golden and low, like lamplight from a dream. The first car was empty. Long rows of seats stretched in both directions, upholstered in green velvet, trimmed with thin brass. You walked slowly, brushing your hand over the backs of the chairs as you passed. The train began to move, not with a jolt, not even with a hum, just the subtle shift of motion, like being rocked to sleep in the arms of something immense and kind. You looked out the window. At first, only trees. They swayed gently, silhouettes painted in fading blue. Then hills. Then stretches of fields dusted with the last light of the sun. Everything outside looked both real and imagined, like a place you might have seen in a dream years ago and never quite forgotten. You sat down in a window seat near the middle of the car. The fabric was cool against your skin, and the train's movement became a rhythm you could feel in your chest. You breathed slower. You didn't know where the train was going, but that didn't feel important. It was enough that it was going somewhere, and that you were allowed to come with it. After some time, minutes or hours, you weren't sure, you rose and began to explore. The next car was different. The walls were lined with bookshelves, reaching all the way to the ceiling, packed with volumes of every size and age. Some had leather bindings that cracked gently when you opened them. Others were cloth-bound and smelled faintly of flowers. You pulled one down at random and opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, not printed text, but script. Familiar looping script. You blinked. It was your own handwriting. Page after page, memory spilled across the paper things you hadn't thought about in years. A letter you wrote but never sent. A journal entry from the night before you left home. A list of wishes scrawled at the back of a school notebook. You put the book back gently. The train seemed to breathe with you. In the next car, golden light spilled from chandeliers made of curled iron and glass. Tables were set for tea. Porcelain cups, delicate spoons, lace doilies. Every seat was empty, but there was one place set at the very end with a slice of cake beside the cup. A flavor you hadn't tasted since childhood. Something simple, something sweet, made by hands that once held yours. You didn't eat it. You didn't sit, but you smiled. The car after that held windows looking out on a night sky unlike anything you'd seen before. The stars were enormous, closer than they should be, pulsing faintly like slow heartbeats. Constellations danced along the glass, not the ones from books, but shapes only you would recognize. A toy, a scarf. A cracked shell from the beach you visited once and never found again. You pressed your palm to the window. The stars moved in response. Somewhere deep in the train, a bell chimed. You turned. Behind you, The doors had closed. Ahead, they opened into a narrow corridor lined with paintings. Not grand portraits, but glimpses scenes from your life rendered in brushstrokes. There you were as a child, hiding beneath a table during a thunderstorm. There again, older, laughing beside someone you loved and lost. Each canvas hummed with warmth. The light didn't just shine on the paintings, it came from them. You passed slowly, hand grazing the wooden frames. Each touch brought a memory with it, not loud or sharp, but soft, like music heard through walls. At the end of the corridor, you found a mirror. Tall, silver-framed, its glass was old, flecked with tiny imperfections like snowflakes caught in time. You looked into it. You expected to see your face, but what looked back was not quite you. It was a version of you, yes, but rested, softer, eyes that had cried, but not recently. Shoulders that had carried weight, but no longer slumped. There was something peaceful in that reflection, as if the train had taken something from you, not stolen, but gently lifted, like peeling off a coat too heavy to wear. You looked at yourself for a long time, then you nodded, just once. The mirror nodded back. The next car was quiet and bare. No seats, no windows. Only light, warm and dim, filling the space like honey. In the center sat a chair. Beside it, a small table. On the table, a folded piece of paper. You approached. The paper was blank, but when you touched it, words bloomed across its surface in ink that shimmered like moonlight. You are the last, you stared. Then the words changed, shifting like sand. Asterisk, asterisk, you are the last passenger. Then again, asterisk, asterisk, you are the only one who remembered to come. Asterisk, asterisk, you didn't understand, not yet. But something inside you softened again. The ache that lived between your ribs began to ease. You turned to leave and saw that the walls of the car had changed. They were no longer solid but transparent like glass. Outside, the world had gone still. Fields of white flowers stretched to the horizon, glowing faintly in the night. The sky above was full of slow-drifting clouds, and beneath them the stars blinked like slow thoughts. You stayed there a long time. Eventually, you returned to your seat. The train rocked gently. The air smelled now of lavender and old stories. You leaned your head against the window and let your eyes close, the rhythm of the wheels pulling you gently toward something unknown. And somewhere far behind you, the door you entered through faded away. You were on the train now, and it would not stop. The train moved without urgency, and time unfurled in the same unhurried way. You didn't know how long you'd slept, but when you opened your eyes, the world outside had changed again. Now the windows showed a coast. Moonlit waves rolled quietly onto black sand. In the distance, a lighthouse turned slowly, casting its beam across the sea like a gentle hand brushing the horizon. The sky shimmered, not with stars this time, but with something stranger, floating lanterns, maybe, or glowing creatures too slow and graceful to be birds. You sat up, but the train didn't jostle. It moved like thought steady, inevitable, soft. In the next car, you found a small hallway with a door on each side. The first one you opened led into a room lined with fabric and ribbon, stacks of paper, buttons and jars, things that once belonged to someone who made things by hand. The air smelled faintly of starch and thread. You touched a spool of deep blue thread and remembered your grandmother's hands. How they moved like a river when she sewed, full of patience and certainty. A little bell chimed as you left. The second room was filled with water, not flooded filled, as though the walls had vanished and you stood on the shore of a still lake, moonlight flickering on the surface. Your shoes didn't sink. Your breath didn't fog, but you heard frogs in the reeds and the distant call of a night bird, and you felt the familiar pulse of peace that only came to you beside water. You sat for a moment. Not long, just enough. You closed the door gently, and the hallway extended ahead like a ribbon of quiet. The next car was a library, but not the kind you saw earlier. This one was a memory itself. The carpets worn where students once sat cross-legged. A chair you remembered napping in during long winters. A table etched with tiny initials, faded now but still visible under the right light. You turned slowly, letting each detail rise like bubbles through still water. There were people here too. Faint outlines. Not ghosts, not quite dreams. Readers, teachers. People who had passed through this space at different points in your life. Some looked up as you passed and smiled. Others turned pages slowly, quietly existing beside you, asking nothing. At the end of the car, there was a door that looked different. Wooden, weathered, with a brass handle that hummed when you touched it. Beyond it lay a garden. You stepped into soft earth. The garden stretched out under a lavender sky where stars drifted like petals caught in wind. Flowers grew in impossible colors, silvers and coppers, shades of ink and storm cloud, glowing from within as if lit by memory. A narrow path wound through the center. You followed it. To the left, you saw a tree with hundreds of wind chimes. No two were alike. They sang gently as the wind moved, but it wasn't random. You realized it after a few moments. They were playing a melody you hadn't heard in decades. A lullaby. You didn't know how you remembered it, but your heart did. To the right, a circle of stones cradled a small fire. It crackled gently. You stepped close and saw that the logs weren't wood, but folded letters. Their ink turned to sparks as they burned. You watched for a while and saw no ash, only warmth. Further along the path, you found a bench made of woven vines. Someone sat there, back turned. Their posture was familiar. When they turned, your breath caught. It was you, not a mirror version, not a twin, but another version of you, dressed differently, aged differently, eyes shaped by choices you never made. This version smiled as you approached. "Do you remember this place?" They asked, in your voice but quieter. You nodded, though you weren't sure why. Your feet had stopped beside them. You didn't sit. The other you didn't mind. "This is where you almost turned back once," they said. "Do you remember that day by the lake? You were holding the letter?" The memory came then, like a soft knock. You had written a letter to leave, to end something. You stood by a lake for hours, unsure. In the end, you never sent it. You tucked it into a book and forgot. The other you reached into their coat and handed you a folded paper. You opened it. It was the letter, unsent, unfinished. You read the words, and they felt like both wound and balm. You didn't cry, but something inside you unfolded like a flower opening after a long winter. When you looked up, the other you was gone. Only the bench remained. The train whistled just once, soft and distant. You turned and walked back through the garden. The flowers hummed as you passed, petals brushing your fingers like farewells. Back on the train, the cars ahead had changed. Now the doors were painted in colors rich, vibrant, each one different. Red, indigo, ochre, sea green. You walked past them slowly. Each one had a small plaque engraved with a single word: forgiveness, firsts, almost, never, again. Truth. You paused at almost. The handle was smooth. The door opened without effort. Inside, you saw scenes that never happened but could have. A conversation you nearly had. A friendship you abandoned too early. A trip you planned but never took. Moments that lived only in the corners of what might have been. And yet, they didn't hurt. They shimmered, soft and golden, like possibilities that had forgiven you. You left the room gently. The next car had no floor. It was sky. You stepped carefully, but your feet found invisible ground. Clouds drifted below you. Stars shimmered above. A horizon stretched in all directions. You walked across it slowly, and the air smelled like all the places you ever loved. Pine forests, summer rains, warm sheets, old books. At the end of the car stood a tall archway, carved with vines and stars. You passed beneath it and entered the final room. It was a quiet room, a room built of silence. Not empty, but still. In the center was a chair. You sat. The walls shimmered and the ceiling vanished. Above you, the sky moved, not quickly, not loudly, but with purpose. A dance of colors and dreams. Then the voice came, not aloud, inside you. Soft and slow and steady, you are not here by accident. A pause. You are not late. Another pause. You remembered what others forgot. You chose to board. You chose to keep moving. You chose to rest. Your breath slowed. Then the voice said one last thing. You are the last passenger, but you are not alone. The room dimmed. The stars above blinked slower. You closed your eyes. And the train continued on. The train rolled on, deeper into a world that no longer followed the logic of time or place. Outside the window, you saw landscapes that seemed born from dreams, fields of feathers waving in a non-existent breeze. Staircases that climbed skyward without end, forests where the trees bloomed lanterns instead of leaves. Inside the train, something had changed. The air felt older now, wiser, as if you were passing into a part of the journey reserved only for those who had traveled far enough within. You rose from your seat again. Each step felt like it carried weight, not burden, but meaning. You reached the next door and opened it without hesitation. The car beyond was lined with clocks. Tall grandfather clocks, tiny wristwatches, strange sundials spinning even in the dark. Some ticked in rhythm, others at odd intervals. Some had stopped entirely. Each one bore a small brass plate etched with a date. You leaned closer to one near the middle. Asterisk, asterisk, the day you stopped pretending to be fine. The next, the day you forgave them. Another, asterisk, asterisk, the moment you realized you didn't have to earn love. Asterisk, asterisk, each tick of each clock was a pulse of memory, echoing softly, not loud enough to startle, just enough to be felt. You walked the narrow aisle, fingers brushing across polished wood and worn brass. With each touch, small scenes flickered in your mind, quiet ones, but full of truth. A breath caught in your throat when you passed a clock labeled, asterisk, asterisk, the time you knew you were worthy. Asterisk, asterisk, you didn't touch that one. You didn't need to. The next car was filled with music. Not from speakers, but from instruments suspended midair, playing themselves. A piano whose keys pressed down invisibly. A cello that bowed long, mournful notes. Chimes that sang with the train's motion. The melody changed as you moved, sometimes waltz-like, sometimes soft as rain. Every few steps, a new theme unfurled around you, as if the music knew what your heart needed before you did. At the far end, a harp glowed with light, its strings made of silver thread. You stood before it, and though you never learned to play, your fingers reached forward. When you plucked one string, a sound rose, not just music, but memory. You standing in a hallway, listening to someone say goodbye. Another string, your hands trembling over a new key in a new city. Another, your voice saying, I forgive you. Even when you weren't sure you meant it, you stepped back gently. The harp continued to hum for a few seconds, then settled into silence. The next car was empty until you stepped inside. Then the walls came alive. Images bloomed around you like ink and water. Not paintings, not film, but living memory, full and present. The first showed you as a child, walking through a summer field, your hands outstretched to catch fireflies. The feeling returned instantly, wonder, warmth, the scent of grass. Another image took its place, a stormy night. You curled in bed, a knock at the door, someone came in. Not to fix anything, just to sit with you in the dark. The scenes continued, some joyful, some sharp with sorrow. Not all were big moments. Most were small, a hand held, a laugh shared, a step taken when you were afraid. Each one felt more real than the last, and through them all, the constant thread of you, growing, becoming. At the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it, a snow globe. You lifted it. Inside, a miniature version of your childhood bedroom. The bed, the shelves, the light fixture shaped like a moon. You shook it gently, and instead of snow, tiny sparks floated through the air. A voice, very soft, spoke from nowhere. Asterisk, asterisk, you carry more than you know. Asterisk, asterisk, you held the globe for a long moment, then placed it back. The lights faded gently. The door ahead opened. You stepped into a corridor lined with mirrors. Unlike before, these did not reflect you. Not directly. Each mirror showed a version of you, but shaped by different choices. One wore a uniform, another held a paintbrush. One was older, one younger, one wore scars you didn't recognize. One glowed with joy. You paused before each. There was no bitterness, only quiet curiosity. Some versions smiled at you. Some looked away. One placed their hand on the glass, and without thinking, you did too. A warmth passed between you. The corridor ended in a circular room. In its center, a spiral staircase leading downward. You hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, out of reverence. The steps were lined with soft carpet. The walls pulsed with quiet light. As you descended, the air thickened, not heavy, but full. Every breath tasted like memory and possibility. At the bottom, a single wooden door waited. You touched it. It opened into a car unlike any you'd seen. It was a bedroom. Yours, not a replica, the room. The one from your current life, recreated in exacting detail. The folds of your blanket, the worn corner of your desk, the way the curtain never quite closed. You stepped inside and felt a tug in your chest. You were not watching a memory. You were standing in the present. On the bed was a note. It read, "You were asleep," and suddenly you understood. You were dreaming. Or perhaps not dreaming, but traveling through something dreams touched. The train wasn't a place, it was a bridge. And you had crossed farther than most ever dared. You looked around the room one last time. Then slowly, you left it behind. As the door closed, you heard the whisper of your own breath. Both here and elsewhere, the train moved on. The train moved forward and you felt something shift. Not in the motion, but in yourself. The dream no longer felt like a dream. It felt deeper now, less like you were sleeping, and more like you had passed through some threshold few ever found. You opened the next door, expecting another surreal chamber. Instead, you were greeted by scent. Fresh rain on stone, warm bread, dried lavender. The air seemed stitched with comfort. This car was a kitchen. A long wooden table stretched on the center, its surface worn smooth by use. There were place settings for many, but only one seat was filled with a steaming bowl of soup, still swirling gently. You didn't sit, but you leaned forward, breathing in its aroma. It reminded you of safety, of home. Not any specific home, but the idea of it, the kind you always hoped you'd build. As you stood there, a memory walked through the room. Not a ghost, not even a person, really. Just the moment crystal clear, a winter evening, you standing by a stove, someone else laughing, chopping vegetables. There was music playing from an old speaker. You couldn't hear the song now, but you felt its rhythm. It had been a quiet night, no major confessions, no drama. Just two people cooking, just being. You remembered thinking, asterisk, this is enough. And for once, it had been. The memory faded like steam from the soup. You continued on. The next car resembled a hallway of old photos. Black frames, matte finish. Each photo moved slightly, not like video, but as if it breathed. You leaned close to one and saw yourself at a birthday party, cake on your cheeks, smiling so wide it made your chest ache. Another an old friend, one you hadn't spoken to in years. They looked right into the lens and smiled, as though they knew you were there. One photo showed a place you'd forgotten, a stone bridge over a green creek. You didn't recognize it at first, but then you remembered the day, a walk after a funeral. You had stopped there and just stared at the water, letting it carry your thoughts away. You had stood there for longer than anyone knew, and no one had rushed you. Each photo was like that small fragments that glowed with more than just memory. They held your presence, as if pieces of your spirit still lingered in those moments, waiting for you to return. You touched one last frame before moving on. The next space was unlike any you had entered so far. It was completely dark. Not frightening, not empty, just still. You took a step forward and felt the ground shift slightly beneath your feet, as though walking on velvet cloud. Then a faint glow rose your footsteps, leaving a soft trail of light behind you. You walked slower now. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken things. A whisper echoed. Not from ahead, not behind, from within. I miss you. You weren't sure who said it. You, someone else. It didn't matter. Another whisper, softer. Thank you. Then, I'm sorry. You closed your eyes, but the dark mist didn't change. You weren't supposed to see anything here. You were meant to feel. You stayed in that car a while, letting it speak without words. Eventually, the far door opened, though no sound marked it. The next car glowed gold. Every surface seemed to emit soft warmth. The seats were plush, the ceiling domed with painted constellations you had never seen before, yet they felt familiar. A small plaque by the door read, ****, this is where your heart rests. ***, you took a seat by the window. Outside, the world was slowing. Not in motion, but in meaning. You saw a cottage beside a quiet lake. You'd never been there, but you had. In dreams. In longing. A place where you would have grown old peacefully. You saw a dog run across a field of windflowers, tail wagging, ears flopping. You smiled, recognizing a long-lost friend. You saw a version of yourself, not younger, not older, just peaceful. Sitting under a tree, eyes closed, a book open on your lap. That you looked up and saw you and nodded once. Nothing more. The train gave a small hum, almost like it sighed. Then something strange happened. The windows began to change, not just showing places, but people. They appeared like reflections, as if standing just beyond the glass. Some were smiling, some were crying, some were just watching you. You realized with a quiet gasp, these were people who had loved you. Some still dead, some never got the chance to say so. But here they were, letting you see it now. One of them mouthed the words, I'm proud of you. Another, it's okay now. You didn't cry. That something loosened in your chest. A knot you hadn't even known was there. As the windows faded back to landscape, you stood and moved to the door. You were ready. The next car was small, circular, simple. At its center stood a dial. It had no numbers, only words, stay and return. You approached. There was no urgency, no pressure. The choice was yours. To stay in this dream world, this train of memory and wonder, or to return to your body, your life, your unfinished story. You stood quietly for a while. A thought rose like mist. Asterisk, there is still more to feel. More to forgive. More to love, asterisk. You reached for the dial, but you didn't turn it. You placed your hand atop it and whispered, not yet. Then you turned to the next door. The train, patient as always, continued forward. The next door opened without sound, and you stepped into a place that felt like a memory half-formed, a space between sleeping and waking, where ideas lived before they became words. The walls of this train car were made of shifting light, not mirrors. Not screens, but fluid glass that shimmered with thoughts. You saw them as they passed, your thoughts, your dreams, your unspoken wishes. One ripple showed you dancing, alone in a kitchen, moonlight spilling through the window. No music, just the rhythm of being alive. Another showed you standing on a cliffside, arms wide, the ocean roaring below. A vision of freedom you hadn't yet dared to chase, but others, they were heavier. One flash of light showed a room you never entered, a conversation you were too afraid to start. Another showed you sitting in a cafe, alone, pretending you were okay. You didn't feel judgment, only truth. These were the pieces of your inner world, not regrets, not even longings. Just fragments of who you had been and might become. As you walked, the light began to respond to your steps. Where your foot touched the ground, colors flared, gently blues, greens, violets. Not bright, but soft and deep, like stars blooming in ink. You reached the end of the car and touched the final pane. It shimmered, then cleared. You saw yourself sleeping, in your bed, peaceful, the real you in the world you left behind. You smiled. A strange small smile, not sadness, not joy, just acceptance. Then you moved on. The next car was vast larger than it could have possibly been, like stepping into a dream that had forgotten its boundaries. Rolling hills stretched on either side. A twilight sky hung overhead. Stars blinked in and out of being. And in the middle of it all, a garden, not orderly or trimmed, but wild and full. Flowers you couldn't name grew beside ones you remembered from childhood gardens. A tree with silver leaves stood in the center, and from its branches hung small bells. They chimed not with the wind, but with your thoughts. You stepped through the garden, and each bell you passed rang with something you had buried. Not bad things, just forgotten things. A letter you wrote but never sent. A kindness you gave but never mentioned. A moment when you chose silence instead of shouting. Each chime brought not pain, but recognition, and the realization that nothing inside you was ever truly lost. You reached the tree and placed a hand against its bark. It felt warm, and it pulsed with a beat, not like a heartbeat, but a presence. The tree knew you. It had always known you. You didn't have to speak. It understood. As you turned to leave the garden, petals fell like snow, catching on your shoulders and hair. They glowed briefly, then vanished. The next train car was filled with doors. Hundreds of them, tall ones, short ones, some carved with symbols, some plain wood, some metal, painted in colors you didn't know had names. You walked among them, not touching yet. Each door pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. Eventually, one caught your attention. Not because it was grand, because it was familiar. It looked like the door to your childhood home. You reached for the handle. It turned easily. Behind it, a memory opened, not one you'd ever fully remembered until now. You were small, sitting on a swing in the backyard. Someone, an older sibling maybe, was pushing you. They were laughing. You were laughing too, but then you stopped, suddenly still. You had asked, "Do you think the stars are watching us?" They had paused, then said, "Maybe, but I think they like what they see," and for a moment, that had been enough. You closed the door gently. You didn't need to step through. You had already retrieved what you came for. Another door opened on its own. It revealed a version of you at a desk, writing, not for work, not for school, just writing because you had something to say, even if no one would read it. Another door. You, standing on a balcony during a thunderstorm, letting the rain soak through your clothes. Each door was a piece of your soul returned to you. And still, the train moved forward. The next car was made entirely of soft, rippling fabric. Curtains hung from every wall. The ceiling was domed and pale blue, like the sky after a storm. A gentle breeze moved through, carrying the scent of something clean and familiar linen, salt and cedar. At the center was a bed, not a replica of yours. Not some childhood memory, just a bed. Perfect in its simplicity. You sat down, and for the first time, your body felt the full weight of the journey. Not tiredness, not exhaustion. Just the gentle sense that something had unfolded inside you, layer by layer. A voice spoke not aloud, but inside your chest. You are almost home. You didn't ask what that meant. You already knew. Home wasn't a place, it was this moment, this clarity, this peace. You lay back on the bed and the ceiling shifted. The fabric above you peeled away to reveal a sky full of constellations, not from Earth, but from dreams. You traced them with your eyes. They shimmered softly like memories you hadn't made yet. And for the first time in what felt like forever, you exhaled fully. Not because you were done, but because you were ready to continue. The final door opened slowly, as if even the train itself knew this was the end of something. The light beyond it was softer than ever before, neither day nor night, but that timeless in-between where shadows are kind and silence is full. You stepped through and found yourself in a round room made of woven threads of gold and smoke. There were no windows here, no visible source of light. Yet the whole space shimmered with a gentle radiance, like candlelight on water. The walls pulsed ever so faintly, as if breathing with you. At the center of the room stood a chair, not a throne, not a seat of judgment. Just a chair carved from old wood, softened by time. You sat down without hesitation. This was not a place for choices. This was a place for stillness. You rested your hands on your lap and listened. To what? To everything. The low hum of the train below, the faint whisper of memories drifting like dust, the sound of your own breath, slower now, deeper. For the first time since the journey began, there was no next door, no decision, just presence. And in that quiet, something beautiful happened. The space around you began to shift, not outward, but inward, as though the room itself folded gently into your chest, settling there like a second heartbeat. You realized the train had not been moving through the world. It had been moving through you. Every car, every vision, every room of memory and wonder, it had all been part of you. Not just a dream, but a return to your center. You hadn't been traveling across distance. You had been traveling across yourself. The chair beneath you dissolved gently into light. You stood weightless and looked around. The walls of the room now shimmered with fragments of the journey. The bells in the garden, the swing in the backyard, the soup on the table, the hands that had once held yours. The words never spoken but always felt. They spun slowly, a constellation of moments, and you were at the center. Then, one by one, they began to rise, carried upward by invisible wind, not leaving, not vanishing, just becoming something new. The train gave a soft sound beneath your feet, a chime, a breath, and then, slowly, the door behind you reopened. You turned. Beyond it, you saw the world again. Your world, dim morning light slipping through the curtains of your room, the quiet hum of a city not yet awake, a clock ticking somewhere far off, the scent of fabric softener, the warmth of your pillow, and something else. A new stillness inside you, a softness, like the train had not disappeared, but rather left something behind in your chest, a thread, a rhythm, a knowing. You stepped through the door and woke up, not with a jolt, not with confusion, but with the kind of peace that stays with you after a long journey, when you've seen yourself from every angle and chosen to return, not because you must, but because you're ready. You sat up in bed. The room was the same, but you weren't. You remembered the tree with silver leaves, the whisper of thank you, the photo of you laughing with cake on your cheeks. And though you couldn't hold them in your hands, they lived in you, now etched in places deeper than memory. You stood slowly, feet finding the floor, body heavier and lighter all at once. The day had not yet begun, but you had. Outside, the world moved quietly, and somewhere, just beneath your heartbeat, The train rolled on, always forward, always inward, waiting for the next time you'd ride it home. And you would, but not yet. Today, you were here. And here was enough.